Good morning in Washington. Good afternoon in Europe. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have another great event for you right now, a little bit in the weeds on the somewhat technical question of how to keep modern Western technology out of Russian or Russian weapon hands. And we have an excellent panel to discuss this with you. We have Jack Crawford, who's the research analyst of the Open Source Intelligence and Analysis of the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, in London. We have Sam Jones, who's the president and co-founder of the Heartland Initiative. We have Benjamin Schmidt, senior fellow of the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. And we have Alena Tragub, who's the executive director of the Independent Anti-Corruption Commission. The conversation this morning will be based upon a joint report prepared by the International Partnership for Human Rights Independent Anti-Corruption Commission on Russian weapons having Western technology. And before I start asking the panelists questions, I want to point out that there is a legal disclaimer at the top of the report. It says something like, the document has been prepared for informational purposes only. The purpose of this report, is to explain and illustrate how Western-made components are used in the Russian committing of war crimes in Ukraine. To achieve this, the report identifies several companies and governments who are believed to be involved in the manufacturing components, which have been acquired by the Russian military. But there should be no doubt here, the report does not allege any legal wrongdoing on the part of the companies or governments who manufacture the components, and do not suggest they have any involvement in any sanctions-related or sanctions evasion-related activity. And with that, we will turn to the questions. So, our first question will be for Ms. Tragub. You are the executive director of the Independent Anti-Corruption Commission, which co-sponsored the report. I would like first for you to describe the report's disclaimer. Also, this report serves two purposes. First, it provides evidence for Russian war crimes. Second, it talks about the foreign components in Russian weapons used against Ukraine. Would you please describe the role of war crimes in Moscow's aggressions against Ukraine and the efforts made to document them?
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst, for your question. Regarding the disclaimer, I want to mention to you that this is not the first report that NACO published on this topic. We published reports on Iranian drones, on just purely about Western components in Russian weapon. But what is new about this report and why this disclaimer is there is because in a rather innovative way, together with the International Partnership on Human Rights, we decided to show the link between these weapons that Russia is building with Western components and the war crimes that are committed by Russia on Ukrainian land. And I want to stress here that all the weapons that we studied in this report, they are pretty much high precision weapons, like Iskander missile, like Caliber missile, like, for example, Tornado multiple launch rocket systems, or H-101 missiles. And yet all these weapons were found to be used in Ukraine against civilian objects, to kill peaceful people, to destroy basically Ukrainian society by bombing schools, bombing dormitories, hospitals, energy facilities. These war crimes are not random. These war crimes is a Russian strategy. And in order to implement this strategy, Russia needs to build these weapons. And in this report, we wanted to show that without Western components, Russia wouldn't be able to accomplish this genocide essentially strategy. And this is why it's important to show this link that companies have complicity essentially in war crimes. At the same time, we understand, of course, in order to accuse a company or a country that knowingly they supplied an aggressor state, Russia, with certain technology in order to commit a war crime, of course, we need a legal process for that. That's why we have a disclaimer. Moreover, I want to stress that we, of course, understand that some of components might be fake, counterfeit, and we just describe the physical appearance of component. We see the marking on component that belong to companies in USA, in Europe, some in Asia, and therefore we describe what we see. But yet, of course, in a legal process, you need to prove that each particular component belongs to that company and was procured in a certain way.
Thank you. Okay. Dr. Schmidt, before we turn specifically to the matter of components, I would like to address sanctions overall. Some observers say sanctions have failed, citing Russian and IMF figures claiming that in 2022, Russia's GDP dropped less than 3%. Others, like Yale professor Jeff Sonnenfeld, say that official Russian figures are unreliable. Russian growth dropped more than that, and sanctions are working. Your views?
Thanks, Ambassador Herbst, and thanks, everyone. Thanks to the Atlantic Council for having this important discussion today. I will just start by saying that since the start of the war, policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic have aimed to deprive the Russian government of the financial and technical means to prosecute its military activities against Ukraine through sanctions and things like this. So to achieve this, Western economic policies have focused, in addition to designation of Russian persons and financial institutions, which of course is a primary and very important sanction to focus on things like energy sanctions to deprive the Kremlin of a key revenue stream, funding its aggression, and on primary and dual-use technology export controls at the system, subsystem, component, and material level to interrupt supply chains vital to Russian military operations themselves. So to answer the question of are sanctions working or not, I get this question a lot, Ambassador Herbst, and I think the best way of going about trying to break this down is to look at the timescales that we're actually expecting to have for efficacy of these sanctions. Certainly, the financial sector sanctions and energy sanctions take a lot of time. They're much longer lead time to have the sort of financial restriction or restrictive measures and outcomes than are things like technology export controls, which we're talking about today, right? So we saw just 3 weeks after the start of the large-scale invasion last February, the Biden administration completely stopped imports of Russian hydrocarbons through an import ban on oil, gas, coal, and refined products from the Russian Federation. That was great. By the end of the year, we saw Europe do the same, and there was also a price cap placed on first Russian Urals oil, Russian crude grade oil, and then later on refined products. So there's definitely a hysteresis in the system of how long it takes before this actually has a significant impact. I think we're going to start to see the larger impacts this year at the macro sanctions level, the macro financial level, because in particular the Europeans were still importing a significant amount of oil and gas throughout last year, especially natural gas, that was really beneficial in helping fill natural gas storages across the continent, but still had those financial streams going to the Kremlin in the interim. So I think we're going to see a bigger impact of that this year. In terms of shorter timescale sanctions, I think that's really what we're talking about today is trying to cut off these supply chains for materials and subsystems and components. And we saw anecdotal evidence earlier in the large, after the large scale invasion began, of things like commercial products needed to be stripped down for their semiconductors and other components from commercial systems. When I say commercial systems, I'm talking about things off the shelf, things like washing machines and dishwashers and other commercial electronics products that are getting repackaged by the Russian military into drones and into other weapon systems. So again, the need for that, okay, that means that there are impacts in the short term happening, but we absolutely have to continue to build out these export controls regimes so that these dual use items, these technologies that we wouldn't say are necessarily military grade or something that we would classify as a weapon system, are also not being able to be cobbled together into weapon systems. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more later on. Thanks so much.
Thank you. In fact, that's an excellent lead into our next question from Mr. Crawford. RUSI has been actively tracking Western technology making its way into Russian weapons. Most observers believe that export controls on Western technology heading to Russia have in fact greatly restricted Moscow's arms production. Do you agree? And how important are the examples of the exceptions described in this report?
Yeah, so thanks, Ambassador Hurst, and thanks again to the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center for hosting this event. I do agree that at least that export controls are an important part of the solution. And I think Ben made a really good point that export controls and sanctions, to a certain extent, seem to have made a difference. But these require a dynamic approach, and they're not, the only answer to this problem, especially regarding export controls. Just adding items to an export control list alone doesn't seem to be 100% effective. Countries and companies are still finding ways to circumvent these control lists, and then Western companies and countries, conversely, are still seem to be finding their footing when it comes to compliance and implementation and maintenance of these restrictions. To answer your second question, I think some of the examples that are highlighted in this report are really critical, and some of the research we've done here at RUSI highlights some similar issues. We released 2 reports during the second half of last year that, like this report, identify Russian companies and individuals who are successfully navigating around these attempts by Western governments to staunch this illicit procurement network. So, some of the components that Russia's importing also aren't simply impacted by export controls. They haven't been listed, and therefore are either being procured legally, licitly, or through other methods that don't require explicit circumvention of export controls. And sanctions may target some of these entities moving these around, but again, that's beyond the scope of export controls directly. And again, facing considering those restrictions, Western governments and companies are facing similar issues with compliance and implementation. The tactics that Russia is using to circumvent all of these restrictions aren't new, and I think we may talk about those in more detail over the course of the panel. But they do require companies and governments to constantly monitor these initiatives and the steps that they've already taken, because otherwise they're just not going to be very effective. I think my fellow panelists will discuss this, and I think we all have more to say on it, so I don't want to get too in the weeds. But you see companies and individuals in Russia using third companies and third countries and falsified trade documentation, including end user agreements, that's created this really dynamic and very quickly changing network of procurement that's snaking through the Euro-Atlantic and further afield, that Russia's relying on fairly heavily to support its war machine.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Jones, you are the president of the Heartland Initiative, which calls on companies to avoid enabling governments that repress their population and that conduct aggression and war crimes. So my question for you is this. What is the calculation of investors interested in companies whose products are found in the weapon systems of countries like Russia, suddenly placed under major sanctions for aggression?
Sure. Thanks, Ambassador Herbst. And just given that the investment angle is probably one of the newest to participants, I'll just give a quick background. So Heartland's primary mission is to assist North American and European institutional investors in preventing and mitigating human rights and material risk across their portfolios, relevant to today's conversations, those associated with business activities and relationships in conflict-affected and high-risk areas like Russia, Ukraine. This includes work with a range of investors, be they asset owners or asset managers, church and state pension funds, boutique socially responsible investors, and larger, more mainstream investors. However, what binds them together is they all generally seek to align their investments with environmental, social, and governance, or ESG criteria. So their formula for assessing risk includes the ways in which their portfolio companies' activities impact the human rights of people in these areas, and the ways in which external factors in such contexts impact their bottom line. As we'll probably get to in the panel, the Ukrainian government is currently tracking over 70,000 potential war crimes and crimes of aggression, including those resulting from the use of weapons with Western components. So the risks to Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure are quite obvious in this context. Further, we would contend that activities and relationships in the Russian market are characterized by some of the most severe and numerous financial and material risks across the globe. These can include, to your point, evolving sanctions and export regimes. And there really has been an unprecedented array of both following the invasion. The potential for strategic litigation against companies that have involvement in these violations of international law. Of course, the brand damage that's associated with doing business with a particular authoritarian regime. And importantly, I would say President Putin's partial mobilization order in September of last year, which requires companies with operations on the ground to contribute to the war effort, either through conscription or providing material support to the Russian military. So like these companies, investors have responsibilities under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is considered the authoritative international framework on responsible business conduct. One of these responsibilities is that companies and investors conduct human rights due diligence. And in conflict affected areas like Ukraine, they are expected to conduct heightened due diligence. Part of this process is to prioritize those business activities that are at the greatest risk for adversely impacting human rights and escalating the conflict. And many of the dual-use component companies that have been highlighted by RUSI, NACO, and IPHR were flying under the radar. They were highly rated by ESG ratings agencies and research providers, and they were included in a majority of ESG funds. However, these investigations, which demonstrated the indispensability of semiconductors and other dual-use components to Russian and Iranian weapon systems, have really necessarily elevated the risk profiles of these companies for investors who are now directly engaging them. And I'm going to stop there and look forward to the next question.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Tragoo, please describe the report recommendations for stopping the flow of components to Russia.
Well, we definitely agree with the recommendation that governments should review their export controls, their sanction policy, and overall, we're talking right now about the multilateral export control coalition, when the governments should be really more carefully looking at how to stop their supply of Western tech to Russia, and they should really also look how they can create policies to encourage their companies, their private sector, to heighten due diligence. And of course, we have a set of recommendations for companies, which Sam Jones already mentioned partially, is that we need companies to basically empower their risk assessment departments, their due diligence department, to basically investigate where they are shipping their products. Especially, they should use the framework of the post-February 24 world. They should understand that if their, for example, client company emerged after the full-scale invasion began, or if they suspect that the company started procuring more weapons, more components, for example, more microchips, significantly more after February 24, this is already a red flag. So they should study deeper and empower risk assessment more. And moreover, they should study the supply chains, because this information is out there. How Russia is circumventing sanctions. In our report, we found that these Western companies, majority of them actually American companies, right? They are selling to Russia through official distributors and sometimes through Hong Kong, through Turkey. This is known. It's a public knowledge. And so if you have a client from Turkey, for example, a new client, you should ask, maybe this is for Russia, right? So they should study supply chain. And the third recommendation is basically that these companies, they should cooperate more with civil society, with government. They should develop some system to exchange information. Because, even though here we talk that this is a super complex topic, in reality, it is not so complex at all. Because look, we are civil society organization from Kiev, and we study mostly government policies, anti-corruption in trading weapons. We were able to find such, precise information. We were able to list almost 30 companies who are now basically implicated in this. And we were doing this using open source data. So if it is easy for civil society to find this information basically on the internet, why company doesn't want to cooperate with us, and why company sends us a letter, response to our inquiry saying, oh, it is so complicated, we didn't know it's going to Russia. We could not study who we are selling our products to. This should not be justification. They should seriously heighten their due diligence system and to prevent this human rights abuses and war crimes, essentially, that are committed with their components. And they should not find this kind of justification, because there are many tools, not only government, civil society, but also, there are artificial intelligence tools that we suggest they use. If we receive response, how do I know it's going to Russia if I have 150,000 clients? It's possible. You put it through financial software assessment tool, you will see some companies have red flags immediately, and then you empower your people from risk assessment to go and dig deeper into those companies. Easy. So I think if they want to do it, they can do it. And our role as a civil society, as a think tank community, policy community, is to basically explain to citizens in the United States, in European countries, that while you are complaining about basically this heavy sanction policy that is affecting negatively economically US, Europe, there is pretty much a simple thing that can be done. You just stop supplying Russia with components to make weapons. It's much easier than the policy that Ben Schmidt was talking about. And this can be done, in our opinion, if not perfectly, but it can be done to much greater extent that it is being done today.
Thank you. Okay. Dr. Schmidt, from a macro perspective, how important is this problem of Western components flowing to Russia? And do you think the proposed steps are sufficient to address the problem?
Yeah, I just want to say, yeah, I agree with what Elena just said. It's much easier, frankly, to do these export controls than it is to do energy sanctions and macro financial sanctions and things like this, and all those regimes that are getting a lot of press in terms of the potential to create sanctions, quote unquote, Ukraine fatigue. Well, I've said this since day one. The only person that needs to get Ukraine fatigue is Vladimir Putin's Kremlin. Okay, so that's the bottom line. We need to give the Kremlin Ukraine fatigue, not succumb to it on our side from sanctions, certainly. But to your point, Ambassador Herbst, on the macro side, given the interconnected nature of the global energy system and technology supply chains, we really need to have calibrated policies that are increasingly focused on the actual foreign policy, national security aims of the states that are issuing them, and that means that you have to actually enforce these. Because aside from the policy architecture that we're talking about, the efficacy of these regimes can only be ensured through comprehensive tracking and enforcement actions, such as we're hearing from Rusi and from Elena's group and Sam's groups, et cetera. But we have to remember as well, we have an unprecedented scope in terms of the size and scale. The Russian Federation, this may be one of the largest export control sanctions regimes, even as deployed now, which is, in my view, insufficient to bring the Kremlin to to stop its aggression in Ukraine, either through financial means or limiting technologies for military use. But it is an unprecedented scale, and the need is there for a broad brush approach in terms of how we do this and look at these different open source domains. For example, let's look at the maritime domain. You can have easily available open source intelligence tools at the fingertips of everybody that's on this call right now, whether they're commodity trading platforms or AIS, automatic identification system based vessel tracking websites. And they're super useful to help monitor malign transfers of products and technologies that would undermine these sanctions efficacy and also get into the hands of the Russian military. And you might say at the same time, okay, well, there's issues with AIS-based vessel tracking because there's efforts to mask or spoof AIS-based location tracking data sets by vessels that are themselves working to avoid visibility of their sanctions activities. This is the so-called, quote, dark ship problem. I want to remind folks that we are in a new regime now that we weren't in even 5-10 years ago, where from open source intelligence, not from government-based satellites, these data sets can be backfilled by combining data from an array of open source tools, and that includes open source optical and radio frequency data sets from the burgeoning commercial space sector. You look at companies like Planet and others like that, they are available, and some cost a little bit of money, but some are just available for free online. And so with this fleet of geospatial imaging platforms operating in low Earth orbit, we in the in the think tank community and the academic community need to really leverage this to try to close off these loopholes where sanctions evasion takes place. But the thing that I'll call on everyone today, we need to remember that civil society, academia, think tanks, NGOs, and investigative reporters need to have a significant, vital role for watching out for reporting on illicit activity to circumvent sanctions goals, because it's happening. And this work is really instrumental to build capacity, again, because we're talking about one of the largest sanctions regimes ever deployed, to build capacity for government entities attempting to operate in good faith, and also to help the concerned public pressure those governments and companies with less rigorous implementation, which we've heard about already today.
Thank you for that. But let me ask you a follow-up which is related to this. Export controls in the United States, at least, are under the authority of the Commerce Department. Is the U.S. government doing enough following up on implementation of export controls vis-a-vis companies, vis-a-vis governments on this issue?
Well, I think there needs to be more that needs to happen. I asked NASA Administrator Nelson a question about space technologies, for example. I keep harping back to the fact that we need an all of government approach, which I think that to a great extent we are doing in this country. But we need to make sure that the science and technology that undergirds all of these technology export controls policies has a seat at the table consistently in our policymaking and our enforcement. Right? We can't just make policy decisions that are purely geopolitical in nature. There is clearly a science and technology role here. And so when I take the example of NASA, I asked Administrator Nelson at a public event several months ago, what is NASA doing to make sure that the continued space cooperation that we have with the Russian Federation on the International Space Station, for example, is not somehow helping Roscosmos, the Russian purportedly civil space agency, allow them to transfer technologies, even if they are not overtly military in nature. They could be used for dual use. Remember, we're talking about dishwashers and washing machines. Certainly, technologies that are used to get to space and back are concerns. And the response I got was kind of this emerging interagency format where there is this large scale review of the sort of technologies that are going to the Russian Federation or allowed for export. But I think it needs to be made a lot more strict and a lot more restrictive in terms of what goes over. And frankly, when we're talking about space, I think that after the International Space Station is done, I think there is no more geopolitical, technical, or sense otherwise in continuing U.S. Traditional cooperation with Putin's Russia. Not to say that we can't have cooperation with another Russia in the future, but Putin's Russia certainly, I think, does not merit this level of space cooperation. And, you know, for those that say, oh, well, you know, we've had this cooperation for decades, the Apollo-Soyuz mission, et cetera, that was a different era in the Soviet Union that we're trying to build trust, et cetera. There really is no trust right now with everything that's going on in terms of the Putin regime conducting war crimes in Ukraine. And so after the International Space Station is basically moving to a new cooperation regime after 2024, when Russia should or purportedly is going to exit, I think that we basically need to take the same approach that we are with China, right? No one's saying we need to increase space cooperation at that level with China, but certainly folks still say that with Russia. So I think we need to end that and really think about these other sort of multidisciplinary sanctions regimes that can be placed.
That's a very interesting example. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Crawford, are there any problem countries facilitating component transfer to Russia? Do you think that NATO and EU countries understand the severity of this problem and are ready to work together to fix it?
Yeah, I think both of those are interesting questions, and not totally unrelated. I wouldn't call them problem countries, but there are certainly jurisdictions where Russian companies seem to be more frequently or more readily exporting Western components. I think we've named Turkey and Hong Kong, and the kind of wider regions around these two hubs seem to be rapidly increasing in popularity and in terms of how frequently they're being used, especially since the reports that we published at the end of last year, and the data that we've been tracking and analyzing since. Hong Kong is only becoming a more popular destination or a transshipment destination for these components before they end up moving on to Russia ultimately. On the second question, in conversations with some of the partners representatives with whom we've spoken on this research, it does seem like Western countries are waking up to the complexity of this problem. I don't think it's an easy issue. I don't think anyone does. But I think when you bring in questions about institutions like NATO and the EU, it becomes all the more complicated. I think luckily NATO and the EU are well positioned to tackle this, and it seems like an opportunity where the two organizations are in place to cooperate specifically regarding sanctions implementation and export control standardization across the Euro-Atlantic. You saw in NATO's 2022 strategic concepts that it seems to at least indicated an interest in grappling with questions of economic security. And then again, in this January more recently, the joint task force that was announced between NATO and the EU to tackle vulnerabilities or weaknesses in Western critical infrastructure and supply chains. The task force is a good first step. I think the first priorities that were announced for the task force include energy and transport and digital infrastructure and space, maybe, all really critical issues, but none of which talk about the vulnerabilities in supply chains explicitly. So it's important for this platform specifically to not be passed over or underutilized as an opportunity to prevent third-party exploitation of Western supply chains. And this is true for other actors beyond Russia, like China as well. So I don't think it's a question of will in terms of addressing this issue. I think the political capacity or willingness to do something is there. I do think it might be a question of capacity in terms of actual resources that the specifically European governments can dedicate to this. And I think countries or companies and institutions across both sides of the Atlantic maybe also as well. I think EU governments are struggling a bit with a couple of different things. I think inconsistencies in how these sanctions are being applied, or gaps between EU sanctions or delays between EU sanctions and other sanctions implemented unilaterally or bilaterally among other NATO allies or Western governments. I think there's insufficient monitoring. I think governments simply lack the resources to effectively monitor and take action against some of these procurement networks. I don't think they were maybe highly valued or as critically needed up until quite recently. And so I think that there's a bit of a catch-up game that's being played. I think between the two institutions specifically, there's a lack of interoperability tools for collaboration or sensitive information sharing. And again, I think opportunities like this task force are chances to kind of fast track some of the progress towards heightened cooperation. But thinking forward, I think the West has to start planning ahead. We know what components are most critical to Russian systems now. because we're seeing it thanks to the great work from Nico and other organizations, in addition to RUSI. But what components might be critical in the future? Who might Russian entities be transferring to if current executives or current companies are sanctioned? Putin's tried and failed for decades to wean Russia off of Western products. It doesn't seem like he'll be able to do so now. I think if these two institutions want to maximize their comparative advantages, there are opportunities for investment, in monitoring tools and information sharing platforms, cooperating specifically with commercial analytics and data providers, as well as actual manufacturers and companies to identify export control and sanctions evasion networks at scale. I think, obviously a lot of the impetus also lies on these corporations to do their due diligence. I think we've heard similar things with companies saying, well, we're doing what we can, but then other companies come to us and say, well, actually, we're taking XYZ steps that go beyond what we're required to do because we realize this is important and goes beyond, a bottom line question. And I think corporations on both sides of the Atlantic could take more steps to doing that as well.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Jones, what steps are investors taking and what measures are they recommending to their portfolio companies to better manage their risk exposure in this situation?
Thanks, Ambassador Hurst, and thanks to Jack for the elegant transition. So essentially what investors are doing are they're directly engaging their portfolio companies, whether those are located in the United States, the Netherlands, Taiwan, especially among the semiconductor companies. And that engagement looks like behind the scenes or private conversation or filing shareholder resolutions to bring the risk prevention and mitigation measures to a vote at annual shareholders meeting. I'll say that disappointingly, by and large, companies have responded in one of a few ways. One, to Jack's point, we're doing everything we need to do in terms of following current sanctions and export controls. Number two, that the dual use components in the reporting are legacy components, meaning they've been in circulation for a long time. And number three, that these are off the shelf components and they can be procured anywhere. And so it's impossible for us to stop this. But again, thanks to the reporting of our colleagues, that reporting has enabled investors to go back to the companies and say, hold on a minute. First of all, in terms of sanctions compliance, it's not as if these entities and individuals became bad actors at the point of sanctioning. President Putin has been telegraphing his ambition certainly since 2014, and the occupation of Crimea and Ukrainian international civil society have reported on a number of these companies and individuals since that time. So sanctions compliance does not get us where we need to be. Number two, that you really, and this gets to the point Elena was making, the order of the day is improve know your customer due diligence. That there are any numbers of specific steps that companies can take to do, whether that's integration of human rights red flags into know your customer, whether that's better monitoring of your chain of custody, as these components go to authoritarian states. And number three, during one particular company engagement, we asked the company if RUSI can basically track this component from point of manufacture to point of prohibited end use. Why can't you? And this gets to Ben's point that in an age of open source intelligence, companies have been taking a de minimis approach, and the time for that has to change, or it has come for them to change. The other piece that investors are looking at is that a number of investors have exclusionary investment criteria around weapons. In other words, they necessarily exclude investments in weapons that are fundamentally incompatible with international humanitarian law. Think cluster munitions, anti-personnel landmines, things of this nature. Now, dual use components wouldn't fall into that category, but the next evolution of exclusionary criteria looks at conduct-based exclusion. In other words, what companies are providing key components to states involved in violations of international law. And so I think, it underlines the point that companies would be well advised to take the findings in these reports seriously, given the indispensability of these components to Russian and Iranian weapon systems, and consider the potential material risk it has in terms of future investments in their companies.
Thank you. Okay, we're now ready for audience questions. We've got a question from Ilona Hamelova, who's on the Economic Security Council of Ukraine. The question is this: under Article 25 of the Rome Statute, individuals may be criminally responsible and liable for punishment if they act with the purpose of facilitating the commission of crimes and provide the means for its commission. Do you believe that this mechanism could be used? What other institutional basis could enable real legal responsibility of international business which assists Russian aggression and war crimes? Elena, you want to give this a shot?
Well, it's a pretty complicated question.
It is.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Yeah, sure. We have examples right now when companies like a French company, Lafarge, was fined because of the human rights violation, because the link was proven that the company essentially was complicit. Here, it's important, I think, to answer this question, it's important to understand whether it can be proven that the company knowingly supplied basically Russia with tools for war crimes. And I don't want to name, but in our research, since we published already 3 reports on this, we go through hundreds and hundreds of companies, but there are some very popular big companies that are maybe that they occupy like 1/4. One company takes 1/4, another company takes another quarter of all, for example, American components. And these companies, for example, I think are in the hot seat right now because there are so many articles published about them, so many reports, investigations, and so on. And yet, in our report, we found components supplied as late as November 2022, already after the beginning of full-scale invasion. So, of course, I think it's case-by-case basis, but I think that the companies should be very careful, exactly what Mr. Jones said. Even though right now maybe there are no lawsuits, we do not know what will be in the future and how this whole story, the war, the genocide will unfold. And the international tribunal and all the justice mechanisms that are being set now in place for the Russian aggression.
Thank you. We have a question from Valeria Melnichuk, which kind of follows up some things that Ms. Dragub was discussing. Question is this: what prevents large Western companies from putting in place effective compliance, due diligence, and risk assessment systems to prevent their components from ending up in Russian weapons? Mr. Jones, you want to give this a shot?
I mean, I think it's a lack of pressure, at least up until recently. Again, companies have been content resting on their laurels in terms of sanctions compliance, export control compliance. And the fact, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that a lot of these companies have been included environmentally, social, and governance rated indices, scores, et cetera. And so are heavily traded among investors that have socially responsible commitments. But here again, this highlights the critical role played by civil society for investors in bringing to light severe human rights risk in the case of Russian and Iranian weapon systems used in Ukraine. And so it's a matter of pressure from all sides, pressure from policymakers and regulators in terms of having those sanctions regimes and those export controls evolve with changing times, and the reporting that RUSI has done around the ecosystem of intermediaries. It's in terms of civil society bringing these reports to mainstream public opinion, which puts brand pressure on these companies. And it's a matter of investors, whether privately or publicly, engaging them and say, hey, we expect more. Legal compliance is not human rights compliance, and we expect you to take the necessary steps.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Yulia Danilenko. It's a question for Mr. Crawford. Is there an approach that can effectively stop Western companies from providing Russia with double use, but formerly civilian technology? Which of these double use products pose the biggest problem? What are the steps needed to stop this circulation to Russia? Quite a mouthful, please, Mr. Crawford.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the short answer, unfortunately, is the word stop makes it difficult. There's not one across the board solution that will guarantee that these components, especially dual use components, won't eventually reach Russia. And I don't think the goal has to be completely stopping the flow of these components. The goal has to be slowing them down enough that pressure is applied to Russia's ability to procure and manufacture these weapon systems that they're using in their invasion of Ukraine. So, if the bar becomes mitigating, if the goal becomes something less absolute, I think there's lots of things that can be done. But again, there's not just one thing that can be done. I think all of the solutions and recommendations that we've talked about today on the panel will improve this. I think the corporations have a massive social corporate responsibility to continue finding ways to better maintain and better monitor where their products are ending up. Maybe that means improved due diligence. Maybe that means reaching out to distributors and exporters and saying, we realize that we're sending these to you. Where are they going after this? It's almost going to require a jigsaw case-by-case approach to develop a really dynamic and very specific approach, and that'll vary by country, and that'll vary by alliance, vary by institution, because it has to be tailored to the specific vulnerabilities facing each of these actors and each of these entities.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Agnes Nicolescu. This is for you, Dr. Schmidt. Following the successive price caps set on Russian crude and then on its refined oil products, Greek-owned ships are increasingly alleged as engaging in G7 sanctions circumvention, in addition to UAE and Indian ships. They achieved this by reportedly adding more intermediaries to the shipping and insurance supply chains. Could you detail a bit on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it speaks to not only sanctions enforcement, but some of the sanctions architecture that's been set up in and around the energy regime, but also it's energy sanctions regimes, but also on the oil price cap. I'll point to an example. The U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, at the end of last year, put out guidance around the price cap. And one of the things that I was concerned about at the time was that it put a provision in allowing for quote unquote safe harbor provisions for maritime service providers. This measure would shield service providers from secondary sanctions designations should they deal with a supplier providing false claims of compliance with the price cap, which is, you can imagine if they're a malign actor already, the idea that they're not going to just, provide false claims of compliance with the price cap is pretty obvious. So this is a potential loophole that Putin could sail a tanker through, basically. And what we need to do is make sure that when we're talking about G7 countries, EU countries, et cetera, right, within our own sanctions alliance of democratic states, that we don't succumb to this thinking that became in vogue at the end of the last decade with respect to the Nord Stream sanctions saga, where the notion was that allies don't sanction allies, so the United States can't sanction Nord Stream 2 AG, that for example is not a Western company but based in Switzerland but 100% owned by Gazprom. And there was a number of instances where sanctions weren't taken or delayed because of that sort of concern. It's obviously not the case that that the United States or that the West doesn't sanction malign actors within operating within each other's jurisdictions. And there's many examples of this. We sanction folks that are malign actors that are operating in Western countries all the time. But we can't make these general policy decisions to create loopholes, right? They had the situation with Nord Stream right before the war happened, where Gazprom, working with the state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, set up a a quote unquote climate foundation, but it was actually, very publicly set up to help avoid sanctions because of the notion that they believed that the United States and the Biden administration in particular would not sanction an entity that was purportedly part of the German government, even though it was 99, 98, extremely funded by Gazprom funds. Now it's a big scandal. You're seeing headlines about this all the time, but it was known at the time, and there was a decision made not to sanction that entity or the vessel that it owned, the so-called blue ship. And now that we're in this post Nord Stream sanctions regime, I think that needs to be done as well, right? We still haven't righted that wrong in terms of policy. So we need to signal that we are willing to take the sort of secondary sanctions actions that are needed to really staunch this, this flow of technologies and energy and all these sort of things that are set up to bust sanctions.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. All right. We have a question from Paul Tonto, and I'll put it out there for everyone to jump in on, but quickly, maybe no more than a minute apiece. What penalty would this panel think appropriate for sanctions busters, and who should apply it? Mr. Jones, quick 1 minute answer.
I was afraid you were going to call on me first. Look, in terms of who should penalize us, from at least from our perspective, investors have a role of penalization here, either through the divestment of funds in those companies, or through added public pressure and investor coalitions that that essentially indicate we view your sanctions behavior as a material risk, and we're not willing to continue to endorse it by virtue of continued investment.
Thank you. Ms. Tragub.
Well, in case it's a dual-use product which is subject to sanctions, regulation, export control, we have now ongoing criminal investigations that I'm aware of in the United States against US companies who were supplying components to all these weapons we discussed, Russian, Iranian. And I think that my recommendation, what I want to mention, of course, I agree that investors and companies, it's a self-regulatory market mechanism. But European Union, actually, they need to adopt more strict regulation that would enable also some criminal investigations against components which are not like off the shelf, but we have evidence in our reports that basically pretty much clearly military components were still sold to Russia, dual use. And basically those companies, if they are located in European countries, they should also be subject to criminal investigation, but European legislation is more relaxed about it than American, unfortunately.
Thank you. Mr. Crawford.
Yeah, gosh, what a question. I think whatever the penalty or the action has to be, it needs to be permanent. I think we've seen with other measures taken that it's really easy for some of these sanction busters to just place someone else in charge of the company, or to create a new shell company or a front company, and then keep engaging in the same activity. So these indictments that you're seeing in the States and in the Netherlands and elsewhere are, I think, a really great first step. Thank you. Finally, Mr. Schmidt, Dr. Schmidt.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that we need to start thinking about next steps with companies that have not exited their operations in the Russian Federation that are operating in Western jurisdictions. Sam pointed out something that I think that is underappreciated in the Western policy community, which is the fact that these companies, for the most part, there's a number of examples. I'm not going to list the company names here necessarily, but you can see in public reporting from Reuters and others that these companies operating in the energy space, for example, are and have complied with Russian law vis-a-vis the war, Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and they've complied with the mobilization efforts. They've made available their personnel under Russian law to be mobilized and sent to the front. If we're not willing to even consider secondary sanctions on these companies because they're Western, that's a problem for us, right? We should have, I mean, if we're spending all of this money to supply Ukraine with weapons, which we need to do more of, and put sanctions down, which we need to do more of, we need to be making sure that we're also not allowing our own companies to in any way support this, whether overtly or not, support Russia's illegal invasion. So that really needs to be considered quickly.
Thank you. All right, we have a question from Albert Lee of Overt Defense. The question is this: some hubs for Russian wealth and corporate offshoring have now become hubs for money laundering and laundering of dual-use electronics, following the Russian large invasion of Ukraine. What courses of action does the panel think are more feasible to crack down on these hubs in the short to medium term? Ms. Dragoo.
Yeah, well, I think definitely secondary sanctions, investigations against those hubs, especially that, they are known right now, and also government-to-government cooperation. U.S. government can talk to other governments, European Union can talk to those hubs and basically find some solution because it's becoming too much right now. Those hubs are so much well known now, even to general population, that it's becoming awkward not to do anything about it.
Okay, thank you. Our final question is from Bogdan Kovalenko from Ukraine. Question is this: some experts mentioned the necessity to strengthen export control and to check through supply chains that may be connected with Russian weapons. The question is why companies haven't done that yet and allowed technology to go to Russia. And then more specifically, and I think Ms. Dragoo may have addressed this, how are the companies to check the supply chains connected with Russia? Mr. Jones, you want to give that a shot?
Just very quickly, I think companies just need to think outside the box. If there are organizations that are using open source intelligence to effectively trace from point of manufacture to point of prohibited end use, then work with those organizations behind the scenes to improve your own chain of custody monitoring and figure out creative ways to better disrupt the flow of dual-use components into Russian and other authoritarian hands.
Ms. Dragoo?
I just want to address the first part of the question. Essentially, what right now Putin is doing, he's weaponizing globalization, right? We have a free trade, globalization, and Russia is using it for their advantage. And the thing is that majority of these components we're discussing here at this panel, they are not even subject to export controls. And some of them, it should be reviewed. The export controls should be tighter, and also countries should work together, because it's impossible to have a unilateral regime. It's impossible to have multilateral regime when there is strengthened international cooperation to stop Russia from pursuing this crime of aggression and genocide in Ukraine.
Thank you very much for that. Our time is now up. I appreciate everyone's participation in this panel, and thanks to the audience for tuning in. And we'll be doing more on this in the months to come.